morning, everyone. Good morning, good morning, good morning. Good morning. We're about to blast off with today's rockets. Karen, why don't you call the people? Karen, why don't you call the people in from outside? Good morning, everyone. So it's great to see you all here, and it's wonderful to be able to welcome Kate to give the breakfast talk this morning, breakfast seminar. Kate is, well, there's so much to say about her that I could take the whole breakfast talking about her career, but I'll leave it to her to actually talk about it. But this book is the product of her PhD, which she wrote at SWAP, and it's actually the product of years of work, years of activism, years of engagement with developmental issues. So Kate comes from a history of activism. She was the president of NUSAS, the National Union of South African Students, in the early 1980s, which was the period of the launch of the UDF. This was a political period of activism across many different sectors where everybody was linked up. Students, labour, community activism, and of course underground the ANC. So Kate moved on then to work for the National Union of Mine Workers, where she started working on developmental work with retrenched mine workers, working on co-ops. This was in a way a kind of experiment where she explored the limits of co-ops to solve the employment problem of retrenched workers, and then moved on to new solutions in the Mine Workers Development Agency to explore solutions beyond co-ops. And ultimately, I mean, if I can follow her trajectory all the way through, she became one of the key architects of the community work program. A number of you will have been here at Themba Masondo's presentation in the first semester, where he talked about the CWP and about his PhD research on the CWP. Well, the fact that there is a CWP program we owe to a couple of people, and one of them is Kate. She's now working on supporting the CWP program through government institutions. So that's a lost Google map, because actually Hoffman House isn't on Google at the moment, so no wonder she's lost. Anyway, so really at that point I'm going to hand over to Kate. I mean, I think she's going to take us through a remarkable trip, a remarkable career of experimentation and work around developmental challenges and creating employment and livelihood opportunities. So over to Kate, and a big round of applause.
Thank you, Carl, and it's really lovely to be here and actually to see some familiar faces that I've not seen in a long time. I want to start with an acknowledgement that is not sufficiently made in the book, in fact, which is to the role of the university in providing the intellectual space for exploring ideas, for grappling with the interface between praxis and theory. And in that process, certainly Eddie's role as performing an intellectual challenge function in my life for a very long time, a couple of decades actually, is certainly acknowledged in the book. But I think that wider role of the university, so I did my honours at SWAP, at WITS, on co-ops, then went into NUM and came back to do my PhD to reflect once more. So I just want to acknowledge that up front. Okay, so the story starts a long, long time ago, and when I was looking at these dates, I was thinking, oh my God, some of the people in this audience won't have been born at the point that I joined the NUM. And that is true. So, the story begins a long, long time ago with the 1987 strike, who others in this audience will remember well. It was the height of apartheid oppression. NUM was only 5 years old, but it had already become the biggest union in the country. Yes, Ramaphosa was the General Secretary at the time. That strike was actually more like an industrial war. Tanks, guns, goldfields had patented their own rubber bullets. 11 mine workers were killed, many were injured. The key thing in terms of this story, however, is that 40,000 mine workers were dismissed. And NUM took the decision to set up a job creation unit to try to create jobs for these workers across Southern Africa. They were returned to mine labour sending areas across Southern Africa. It was an unusual decision, it's still an unusual decision actually, for a trade union to decide to invest in a job creation unit for ex-members who had no prospect of returning to the mines and to invest in their communities. And that was the genesis actually of the concept of a social plan that was then promoted. The process started with worker co-ops. Over 30 were established in South Africa, Lesotho and Swaziland, and that was the first phase of this journey. In the presentation here, what I want to focus on is strategy, development strategy. What works, what doesn't work. Strategy is about how policy is implemented. We have fabulous policy. We often talk about the problem being a problem of implementation, but actually often there's a missing link there. It's not so much a problem of implementation, it's about strategy. How are you going to get to deliver the purpose of the policy? And it's at the level of strategy that policy often fails. There is also a strong theme here around markets, as you will have gathered from the title of the book. Because in any form of enterprise activity, including co-ops, markets matter. The market rules of the game, explicit, informal or hidden, they are the rules by which, at some level at least, you are playing. You're in. No point being against markets if you're going to be involved in enterprise development. Those are the rules of the game. This was not so clear to us at the beginning, I have to say. Nor at the beginning did we even think to ask the question that was posed to us later, which is, can markets be made to work for the poor, or even just better for the poor? When that paradigm emerged late in this process, and we'll get to it, part of the hollow laughter on the left was my own. But it is, in fact, a serious question that goes to the heart of the relationship between markets and society, the nature of markets as institutions, and the resultant distributional regimes that emerge in societies. These are important questions. And so the journey began, and I'm going to take you, I hope, on a rapid and rollicking ride through the journey that followed, where everything we thought we knew kept getting challenged by praxis. And we had to relearn, rethink, re-strategize. And that's the journey I hope to take you through here. So let me start with the co-op strategy. There were lessons from success as well as failure. Actually, there were some remarkably successful NUM co-ops. In Lesotho, they became the largest local suppliers of fresh produce for a period. 8 co-ops, mainly in Lesotho, became genuinely financially independent, building up reserves, paying regular, although low, wages, and surviving for over 5 years, which for a worker co-op is actually quite remarkable, and some of them survived for more than 10 years. So the story of the NUM co-ops is not a story of co-op failure. The most important lessons actually came from the co-ops that were successful and the challenges they faced, providing binding constraints, if you like, on overall success. I'm going to focus on just some aspects of the lessons around co-ops. On all of these issues, there's more in the book. On the issue of markets and job creation, the point is to succeed. Co-ops have to compete in markets against other co-ops. NUM co-ops were competing against NUMSA co-ops, it has to be said, in selling t-shirts at Kasatu events, but also against private companies. The number of jobs they can create is limited by the scale of their market share. The number and level of wages they can pay is tied to the scale, not just of the production, but of the sales. If you don't sell, there's no income, there's no wages. Finish and apply. I always use this sum because it shocks people, even economists who don't often do sums like this actually. A co-op of 20 women who want to earn a meager 1,000 rand a month each, at a labour intensity of 50% of the cost of sales going to labour, have to sell 250 dresses a month to pay that meager wage. Now people don't make this calculus. That's a lot of dresses if you're in Tula Maharaj, or if you're in the Lusiki city. To sell 250 dresses a lot, that's a lot. And if you don't, you won't pay that 1,000 rand a month. Those are the economics that people deal with when you're trying to create jobs through these mechanisms. And part of the tragedy, in a way, is that because of the imperative of creating jobs, co-ops take on more members than their market share can support. That was certainly the case in Num. In fact, as you'll see in the book on the back of a cigarette box, we ended up doubling the number of members per co-op, and as a result, halving the wages that were earned. It's a recipe for self-exploitation, and it's a recipe for co-op failure, and it's a recipe that so many worker co-ops in South Africa have repeated. Those challenges are compounded by the significant complexity of democratic management. Part of the vision of co-ops, part of the inspiration of worker co-ops is that they challenge the conventional model of business organization. But that's hard. It's particularly hard if you've never been employed and you've never run a business. And so often in co-ops, those are the people who are looking to worker co-ops to provide them with an income and with a job. And it's tough. There are also a range of incentive problems in the traditional co-op form that I'm not going to go into here because there's so much else to cover. But the net effect of all of this meant that, and does mean, I believe, that if the purpose is job creation, if your purpose is job creation, then worker co-ops are an unwieldy instrument with which to achieve it. That was the conclusion we came to in Num, and I'll get on to that. But what I want to also highlight are a wider set of strategic choices around co-ops that are less often discussed and that relate to their place within markets and within development strategy. I'm going to do a very quick and incomplete typology, but worker co-ops, there are different kinds of co-ops, and they fit in different ways. Worker co-ops are worker-owned, worker-managed. All the workers are members, all the members are workers. The purpose is job creation, but it's also democracy in production, an alternative to the conventional firm. And the main source of livelihood of members is the co-op. It matters a lot, the stakes are high. In a user co-op, like a consumer co-op, however, it's consumer-owned. The consumers democratically elect a board, the board appoints staff. The staff are employed on conventional employment contracts. They may also be members of the co-op, but their relationship as employees is on a conventional contract. Consumer co-ops are not, yes, people have tried to play with the model, but in general, their primary purpose is not a new form of economic organization. It's to develop economies of scale that benefit consumers. The purpose is cheaper goods for consumers through economies of scale, and for most members, it's not the main source of their livelihood. If it works, fantastic. If it doesn't work, it's not a huge deal. Then we come to producer co-ops, like farmer co-ops. Here, the members are producers, e.g. farmers. Again, the farmers come together. They elect a board. The board appoints staff. The staff are very seldom also members because the members are producers, they're farmers. The purpose is, again, economies of scale, storage, marketing, to make producers more competitive, to enable smaller farmers to compete in markets. Now, these are examples of typologies. They're different, under user co-ops, you would also have co-op banks. I'm just using these as examples to explain the typologies here. They differ in complexity. They differ in forms of management. They differ in the impacts on members and in their relationship to markets. Oops, that went weird. Don't know what that was. Sorry, those aren't meant to be so huge. The key point here, though, is that in worker co-ops, the number of members they can absorb is constrained by their market share. So whether they have 15 members or 20 members can make a huge difference to what members earn. It's a big decision. Whereas in a consumer co-op, the more members, the better. Similarly, in a producer co-op, the more members, the better. And what is missing from this slide, which is weird? Sorry, something went wrong with this slide. The point, though, is that yes, worker co-ops can work, and in Italy recently, in the context of the financial crisis, 9,000 jobs were saved through converting businesses to co-ops. Fascinating. Take into account though, now I wish I could remember the figures, they're just off the slide. Let's see if it goes on. No, it's blocked there. Okay, if I can remember the figures correctly, in the consumer co-ops in Italy, one consumer co-op has over 7.4 million members. 7.4 million members. They have 56,000 employees. Okay? Now their purpose is not job creation, but they've created far more jobs. And yet when we think job creation and co-ops, we think worker co-op. Okay? The other issue is that the worker co-op is a market taker. It is so vulnerable to competition in markets. Whereas consumer co-ops are market makers. They can make markets for worker co-ops, but also there's the example in Italy of the co-op, which is the major retail strength in Italian markets, decided it would only stock fresh produce that had used a lower than standard level of fertilizers. And with that one decision, they changed practices across the whole of Italian agriculture. Okay? So you're talking about very different relationships to markets and to market power. Agriculture co-ops. In India, and again, I'm going to get the numbers wrong because they're blocked there, but I think it's some ridiculous figure. Like, there are 17,000 village dairy co-ops that control a huge portion of the dairy market in India. Those are not worker co-ops, they're not worker-controlled co-ops. They are not doing democratic management in their co-ops. They are small producers who've come together in a farmer's co-op, but they have market power. They have market power. They are shaping markets. They're not just market takers. And so this typology within co-ops is, I think, important to the debate around the role of co-ops in development. Which brings us to the fact that NUM then, after 8 years of heavy investment in co-ops, decided that actually this was not a good vehicle for job creation. That although we continued to support those co-ops that were there, the strategy needed to move on. In fact, the president of NUM at the time, James Mclatzy, said to me he wasn't going to speak to me again until I came up with a better strategy, and he didn't. So we had to come up with a better approach. But the decision to move away from co-ops was not just these issues, it was also the strategic limits of a project level focus. And for a wider development strategy, I think this is an important part of the takeout. We had 30 co-ops, that wasn't bad, it was the biggest co-op organization of the time. An average of 20 members each, that was just 600 people. Out of the 40,000 who were dismissed, I mean, it was nothing. It was a drop in the ocean. And yet enormous resources were invested. We had a staff of 30 people. We had a fantastic team. We had agriculturalists. We had people with MBAs. We had, huge resources went into these 30 co-ops. And what were we doing? We were just scratching the surface. And so along with this came a critique of an approach which I've termed setting up projects, which is very characteristic in the South African context. And the problem with this approach is that Judith Tendler coined the term, a critique of the projectizing of poverty. And her critique is that the focus on projects detracts from more systemic issues. We have had local governments where 3 managers will spend all their time managing a small bakery co-op on the premises of local government. This is a true story from China. When the only institution able to effect systemic level changes that can impact on all small enterprises in China is the metro. And so the focus on projects detracts from a focus on the powers that are actually there to have more systemic impacts. I'm not going to go into more detail on the slide, but just the point is that all development intervention, if it's successful, has distributional impacts with winners and losers. That's its purpose, is to change distribution, to impact on distribution, on incomes, on however you want to coin it, but that impacts on power dynamics at a local level. And at the project level, where there are processes of beneficiary selection, where a few people are going to benefit a lot and other people are not going to benefit at all, then you have these complicated processes of choosing the poorest of the poor People don't always want to be identified as the poorest of the poor in their communities. It doesn't necessarily always help them. So there are all kinds of complicated dynamics, but the power dynamics around beneficiary selection can become extremely toxic. They cause conflict. They're open to patronage. It's an extremely poor approach to development. Project-based, micro-project establishment. So what are the alternatives? That's what we had to look at. And in fact, how we got there, I mustn't get too distracted because I've got a lot to cover, but it's a lovely story. Workers at Arnott Colliery, the chair of NUM there, had been involved in the NEC committee dealing with our job creation unit, and so he knew the problems. And we'd just taken this decision to move away from co-ops when a retrenchment was announced there. And he took the initiative to organize mine workers while they were still on the mine into district contact groups that were going to become job creation engines. They went home, largely to the Bushbuck Ridge area, and they called a community meeting, they slaughtered an ox, and they said, we are back, we're not going back to the mines, we're here to create jobs, who will join us? People from the community joined, and they decided they would start by buying and selling live chickens. By sheer luck, it was a very viable proposition. They hired a bakkie, they went to Hazy View, they bought a bakkie load of live chickens, they sold them. Literally within a fortnight, they were making more than members of a co-op had made, over a year of development as individual men. They were making the decisions individually, they were organized as a group, they were organizing collectively, so it was a different form of economic cooperation. But it alerted us to the kinds of opportunities that existed, and to cut a long story short, we ended up setting up what were called development centers. And we set up 8 of these, and a key focus of these were on what were called economic services. And the logic of these economic services was that they would fill a market failure in the local economy, but over time would reach a threshold that would allow them to operate on the basis of full cost recovery. So poultry was an example, and in fact this is what happened. That group, the poultry group, they started by driving to Hazy View to get the chickens. Once they had established stable markets and were doing that regularly, the basis to localize the production of the chickens became clear, and MPA set up a poultry center at Marla Development Center that then was producing those chickens, knowing that they had a market, a distribution market already. Okay? Then, instead of selling the chickens at 6 weeks, we trained the participants to take the birds at 3 weeks when they're less likely to get sick or die. And they would part produce them. So the center then sold the chicks at 3 weeks, which allowed them to double their capacity. Then participants started to take them, then they started to get them as day olds, and then the role of the center disappeared because production had been totally localized through local entrepreneurs. Now, the thing about that story is it's a good development story, but for the center staff in the poultry center, it wasn't such a good story because they lost their jobs. I mean, there was no more poultry center. Yes, we moved them, but the point is there are incentive issues that emerge in that kind of market development context. So, the economic services at the centers included bulk supply of business inputs, and I'll explain that a bit more. The poultry supply centers, the same model was used for seedling nurseries. There was also equipment demonstration and hire and sales. There was also training and counseling. There was also other services that are meant to focus on the economic services. So the focus, the strategy was very much one of supporting local production for local consumption, getting money to circulate in the local economy. And this is just an example of all the production systems that were available at the centers for training, for demonstration, for hire. Okay, then, now what was amazing was that, production doesn't happen in many of these areas. And so many of the simple, appropriate technologies that were used for these things were very new to people. And there was a lot of enthusiasm and excitement. But a key thing that we identified was that a key obstacle to getting engaged in a lot of these things was the lack of business input supplies. If you're going to make leather belts, where are you going to get the buckles? Johannesburg. If you're going to print t-shirts, where are you going to buy the inks? Not in Chulamahash, which is where the Mala Center was. If you're going to make yogurt, how are you going to do the little cups and seal the foil lids? If you're going to make atcha, across the spectrum of business opportunities, the business input supplies are simply lacking in those local economies, and quite hard to source actually. And so the business supply stores, this is the Lesotho business supply store, the business supply stores focus on providing those inputs and enabling. So there was the training, there was the demonstration, and then people were enabled to access the suppliers that would allow them to go into small-scale production. Equipment hire proved to be really important because it hugely de-risks starting an enterprise. You go to the center, you hire the bakery section for a day, and you test. Can you sell the bread? Do fat cooks work better? Should you make muffins? You don't have to make all these investment decisions up front. You can experiment and test. And so the equipment hire facility was actually enormously important. The outcomes were actually great. But a key thing, the users were self-selected. No more beneficiaries selecting. No more going into a community and saying, who's the poorest of the poor to be in my project. None of that, because that's toxic actually in development. So a key feature of the centres, they were open to all. Miners, ex-miners, their wives, and people with no relationship to the mining industry whatsoever. And, like that distinction with co-ops, the more users, the better. That's a good insight. That's a good framework. It's a good developmental driver for the centres as entities. The centres had cluster effects. We learn about cluster effects at a kind of high level in the economy. But actually, at the very local level, there were cluster effects. People learning from each other. People innovating by sharing ideas. There were demonstration effects. We had an exponential increase in outreach and scale. Okay, it won't sound huge. But in the impact evaluation that was done at the time, we had trained 8,000 people. Now, compared to the 600 in the co-ops, that was an exponential increase. It still wasn't touching sides in terms of the scale of need, but nevertheless, we were on a trajectory in terms of scale. There were issues, there were development dilemmas, there were cost recovery challenges. Go into the model in much more detail in the book. For here, what I want to highlight and focus on is the outcomes at the level of the enterprises. How did the enterprises do? So yes, all these new enterprises started. We counted 800 mini bakeries in the then Transkei. Okay, so there was an absolute upsurge in enterprise activity. It was exciting. But how were they doing? We had a very comprehensive impact evaluation. This first graph shows, which I think is quite amazing, and is credit to Num, I have to say, is the level of participation of women. Is that the program was actually very strongly focused on the wives of miners and ex-miners. They took up the opportunities with the greatest alacrity. Now let's look at the earnings from the enterprises. Oh my word, they were dreadful. Absolutely dreadful. I mean, this is the 90s, but still, the figures are dreadful. People were earning next to nothing. And then if you look at the profile of group projects versus individual projects, it also tells a story. Group projects earning really poorly. If anybody was doing okay, they were largely doing so, working on their own. None of these were outcomes that we were happy, well, apart from the first one. So this was a setback. This was not what we were trying to achieve. Why were returns to enterprises so low? This wasn't a pathway out of poverty. This wasn't doing what we were setting out to do. Back to the drawing board. Lots of soul searching. And yes, one of the big answers to that question, why, was a gender issue. Simply, at one level, the fact that most of the women in projects were working part-time was not fully factored into the comparison of earnings. But what was also found is that many women did not want their enterprises to grow, and they had good reasons. Firstly, time and the pressures of unpaid work that they still had to perform. But we actually had a number of cases where successful enterprises were taken over by the husband. So we had a particular case where, as part of the impact evaluation, the evaluator went to visit a particularly successful enterprise that we had highlighted and got there to find that the woman who'd set up the enterprise was now unpaid labor in the enterprise, and her husband had taken over. So a lot of the time, women actually articulated they didn't want to look successful. It wasn't good. Okay? The other issue that was a setback was the mandatory free labor in the fields of traditional leaders, which is still a real thing. And then the group projects fell into all the same traps as the co-ops, with an oversupply of labor, having to deal with greater complexity of management, although people appreciated the social inclusion benefits. So yes, there was a gender dimension. But when we really looked at it, what we found was that the big issue was the structure of the South African economy. A highly concentrated, unequal structure of the South African economy, and I will explain why. This is the consumption basket of a poor household. And I want you in the audience, please, to tell me what you think would be found manufactured or agro-processed products. Let's leave fresh produce aside. It's a different story. Can I hear from you what you would expect to find in that basket? Bread, pap, sugar, oil, tea, flour, eggs, cabbage. Okay, fresh produce. Stick with agro-processed manufactured beans, fish, tin fish, peanut butter, maybe. Okay.
Yeah.
Every single one of those items is mass produced in our core economy, in a monopoly sector that reaches into every village in the society. Every single item. I challenge you to find a manufactured or agro-processed item, from shoe polish to whatever, that might find its way into the consumption basket of poor people that is not already mass produced in our core economy. And this is a fundamental issue for small business development. Local production for local consumption, not so much. The hard bar that goes far, Lever Brothers, has products specifically targeted at women who are still washing clothes in the river. Okay? Now in India, you can make and sell soap, I believe, at the village level, because Lever Brothers is still trying to find the wealth at the bottom of the pyramid and hasn't entirely penetrated. But in South Africa, no. Our strategy was completely flawed. It was so fabulous. Didn't you think it was fabulous? All those lovely local manufactured things, appropriate technologies, producing local production for local consumption, absolutely shut out of the market. Markets in marginal areas are thin, in the sense that people don't buy a lot. Poor people buy a limited basket of consumer goods. They're mass-produced in the core economy at a scale that makes it hard to compete on price, even when you take into account the cost of distance. Distribution systems are highly efficient. Branded goods and branded stores provide quality assurance. People with limited money are very particular about what they buy and how they spend it. They don't want to risk on some dodgy product not properly packaged. You know? Plus, for bigger items like furniture, the large retail stores provide finance terms. You can make the most beautiful desk in the world, but if you can't provide finance terms, they're going to go to the nearest, whatever they're called, the big furniture stores. Plus, this was at the cusp of '94. Aspirations were high, a better life for all. Advertising played on that, and branded goods played on aspirations. People wanted the branded goods, they wanted the better life for all, they wanted the... So it was a moment in time also that fed into this. And I think this is a fundamental point, and it's still valid now. Small-scale producers have to compete on price, quality, brand recognition, and financing terms with the monopoly sector. And it's not a viable strategy. And that is not taken into account when you tell poor people they should self-employ their way out of poverty. So, back to the drawing board. What does this mean for strategy? Well, we did a lot of soul searching, we did a lot of analysis. We know what doesn't work. Local production for local consumption, targeting poor consumers in ways that can't compete on price with the monopoly sector, that can't compete with brand recognition or on payment terms. We now knew that really doesn't work. So, what should we do instead? What if instead we produce products that are not already made in the monopoly sector? Or products that are differentiated in key ways? What if we get a bit more canny and strategic? What if we focus on services where spatial inequality might actually create some advantages? Because if you need your tire fixed, you need it where you are. And it doesn't matter if it's cheaper in Gauteng. Okay? What if we targeted consumers with more disposable income? What if we targeted markets outside the local economy? These were the issues we grappled with. And these are the issues that I'm still dealing with in work on township economies today, because they are still valid, and these same mistakes are still being made in enterprise development strategy today, where people are encouraged to enter into enterprise activity that directly competes with the monopoly sector. So look, still today, live chickens are still a little niche that the monopoly sector has not quite cornered. You can buy a rainbow chicken frozen, but actually people like their chickens live. Okay, so that's still a niche. Smileys are not yet on the menu at McDonald's. In Khayelitsha, this fabulous group of youngsters have set up a coffee shop at the Khayelitsha train station. And there is consumer demand for good cappuccinos on their way to work. So there are new niches. There are new consumer demands. There are services. There are delivery services, for example. Badiba in Soweto, delivering things on a small scale. So the point is to get much cannier about where the gaps and opportunities. And Soweto Gold, brewed in Soweto, sold in Joburg to northern suburbs. So we decided that our next phase of strategy was going to be looking at external higher value markets. What might that deliver? What new challenges would that confront? If instead of local production for local consumption, we produced products that were sold to the rich people, basically, and might that bring new incomes into the local economy in a different way? So that was the next phase of the journey. How am I doing, Carl?
You're doing very well. Actually, very well.
Okay, well, I'm getting there. This is the last phase of strategy, and then it's final reflections. So, we started two processes. The one was called Bridging the Gap between rural craft producers and higher value markets. We knew nothing about craft at the time, but we set about learning. And we held a number of conferences where we brought together designers, retailers, everybody, so that we could understand how to bridge the gap. Because we saw rural craft as one of the competitive advantages, if you like, in some of the areas we were working with. And that, yes, there were these external markets that could be tapped. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on this. I encourage you to look in the book. I'm just going to make a few points about it. The first problem was the gulf in understanding of the value proposition. So what was seen as of value in craft in the local context was not necessarily what was in demand in the upmarket, yuppie markets that we were trying to access. So bridging that gap required intermediation. Now, the so-called middleman, and it's always a middleman, although in the craft sector it's almost always women, the so-called middleman is much maligned. But actually, if you want to bridge the gap between rural craft and New York, you need intermediaries. Okay? You can't make that leap in one go. The other thing we quickly discovered was that the enterprises we've been dealing with, the model was always, you make bread and you sell the bread. You make a finished product and you sell the finished product. Now, when you're dealing with external markets, suddenly you're in a supply chain. You're in a value chain. The relationships change. It adds costs along the chain. So, while our client base, if you like, was used to leaping straight from a producer price was the final price. Now you've got all these costs in between. Costs, buying agent costs, freight costs, packaging costs, storage costs, retailer markups. the end price looks very different. And that's easily seen as exploitation. And sometimes it is. But actually, other times, it's just the cost of accessing external markets. You can't escape these costs if that's what you want to do. Okay, so understanding the role of intermediation and then power relations in that chain, because they can be toxic, they can be exploitative, but all those role players are necessary and they all need a return. And we find ourselves surprisingly confronted with the reality, and I'm going to delve us into a little bit of theory here very briefly. Enter Adam Smith. I never thought that I would draw with great respect on the work of Adam Smith to explain the dynamic that we were confronted with, also looked at by Douglas North. When you contract face-to-face, which is what we had always done, or what entrepreneurs had always done, when you contract face-to-face, what you see is what you get. And you can do that informally. Who needs regulations, registrations, formality, blah, blah. Okay? But as soon as you contract across distance with people you don't know, it's a different ballgame. And actually, it was the defining feature of what was called the Age of Commerce, which is what Adam Smith wrote about. And a key part of that theory was about the transition from face-to-face transactions to transacting across distance, anonymous exchange. Anonymous exchange was the basis of the development of contract law. And Douglas North, the economic historian, talks about complex exchange as the basis of the institutionalization of markets. Until you had complex exchange, markets didn't really need rules because you were just transacting face to face. You made the rules up, as you went. By agreement, you would transact. As soon as it was across distance, you needed rules of the game. And that was the origins of the development of markets as institutions of exchange. And North even argues that without the institutions that govern, without contract law, without secure contract enforcement mechanisms, economic growth cannot happen because you are constrained by your local market. You can only transact face-to-face unless you can create mechanisms that create contract certainty to transact across distance. Very interesting example of this. It's a craft producer, I've forgotten the name of the little company, but they got an order for 100,000 beaded lights from France. To make 100,000 beaded lights, they needed to invest 100,000 rand up front for the raw materials. Now, they didn't know this buyer in France. They asked for an advance because they couldn't, they were scared of the risk. What if they don't pay? What if we make these 100,000 beaded lights and they don't pay? The buyer in France was dealing with a relatively informal producer with not a big track record. They didn't want to pay in advance because they said, well, what if they don't deliver? We can't take the risk. And the sale didn't go through. And that is an example of the need for contract certainty. So both sides of the equation need mechanisms that give them security that if an order is placed and you invest in producing it, you will get paid. And on the other side, if you pay, you will get what you ordered. Okay? Sounds relatively simple, but it's actually quite a complex issue. And one of the implications of this for us and for the sector is that as soon as you transact across distance, it means the end of informality. You can't transact across distance informally because people want to know. They want your bank account, they want an invoice, they want some kind of contract security, they want to know that you exist, that you're a registered business, and so for me, the debates around informality and formality are as much about where are you positioned in markets than anything else. Because there are advantages to informality if you're transacting locally, but as soon as you want to transact beyond, it's a different story. Also, there's a difference in scale, but I'm going to skip that to the final element here, which is participation in value chains. We also initiated the commercialization of products from the marula fruit. And in some ways, this was our most successful intervention. MBA and the CSIR developed a technology, for the first time I might add, that stabilizes marula juice from fermenting, creating the first commercial juice products from marula with fruit time and series. Some of you may remember a product called Marula Mania. Every single marula berry in Marula Mania came from MBA, came from 4,000 women in 42 villages in Bushbuck Ridge. Yes, it was a journey. Okay. I just want to highlight some key lessons on that journey, which was specifically the development challenges of product development and the conundrums around innovation. And this is what we confronted. Here's this fabulous indigenous product. It's prolific in those areas. You know, the berries are literally rotting on the ground because there's far more supply than people can consume, even in marula beer. Plus, there's the juice, but the kernel, the oil in the kernel is a high value oil. It's one of the most highly rated cosmetic oils in the world, but it had not been commercialized. Okay, so here's this incredible opportunity. Here is a resource owned by poor people, owned on communal lands. It's never been commercially farmed, and it's not been commercialized. Okay, but here were the constraints we faced. We did fabulous tests of the properties of marula, and we were able to convince all kinds of people of those properties. But no buyer will invest in product development if there isn't a secure source of supply of the raw material, because it's a huge investment. So they need to know that if they invest in product development, and if they decide to go ahead with production, volume supply is secure. Now, volume supply wasn't secure. I mean, yes, it was on our trees, but, you know, there were no mechanisms. It wasn't secure. How do you do that? Samples were not enough. The problem is, if you don't have a buyer, why would you develop a secure source of supply? Why would you set up all the institutional mechanisms, the pulping, the to provide juice if you don't have a buyer? How are you going to do that? How did we overcome this? Partly we were lucky. We engaged with local juice pulpers in Hazy View. And we had a fabulous advisor who managed to negotiate with a local juice pulper called Bronpro. They had spare freezer capacity, and they agreed to freeze 10 tons of marula juice on spec. Without that, we could never have done this. By the end, we were producing 450 tons a season. But in order to get into the market, Ceres would not even begin a product development process until they knew that Bronpro had 10 tons in their freezers, so that if they wanted to go into production could start. And that only happened because they had a prior relationship with Bronpro. This is the importance of networks. This is the importance of, none of this would have had. So there was no way Ceres, even if we'd frozen 10 tons, there was no way Ceres was ever going to buy from MBA. It just wasn't going to happen, right? But Bronpro was in the neighborhood. They'd become familiar with the center. We existed there. There was a relationship. So they were willing to take that risk. They had spare freezer capacity. They invested 50,000 Rand in adjusting their equipment. It was generous. But they had a existing supplier relationship with Ceres, and so Ceres trusted them. And that's how we got to Marula Mania. But it took 3 years. From the time Bronpro agreed to freeze the 10 tons to the first product was 3 years. The oil, meanwhile, we were in a partnership with NGOs across Southern Africa. That oil is today the base oil of all body shop makeup, by the way. If you use body shop makeup, marula oil from Southern Africa is the base oil. Yes? But that took 6 years. 6 years. The donors gave up on us after 3. It took 6 years before that contract was secured. And the issue here is this. So here are fabulous indigenous resources. But who has the holding power? Who has the capital? The communities don't have the ability to hold 10 tons in a freezer while product development happens. We were accused by this making markets work for the poor approach of distorting markets by using donor funds to support this process. We were told that we were competing unfairly with private investors. Don't agree. The issue is, without forms of pro-poor capital, what market-based processes will allow poor communities to claim this IP, to claim the outcomes of these processes? Okay, so, coming to the end. Sorry?
50 minutes.
Oh, sorry, Paul. Okay, I'll skip this. There was a new paradigm called making markets work for the poor. We disagreed with a lot of it, but we did learn lessons too. And the point is that the question was then posed, can markets ever actually work for the poor? Or even just better for the poor? Or is the process always, inexorably, one of making the poor work for markets? It was around now that I left MDA, and I left with this question unanswered in my mind, and it's unanswered partly to this day. But it is a question that we need to answer. And I came to the conclusion that certainly, in enterprise development on the margins, there is certainly a risk that all we are doing is making the poor work for markets. The returns are so poor. I'm not saying it doesn't matter to optimize the scope for employment from self-employment and SMEs. There are opportunities for meaningful enterprise development and job creation. Yes, it's important. But at the same time, the narrative that expects the solution to unemployment to come from poor people self-employing their way out of poverty is deeply misleading, if not actually cynical. The structural constraints are too significant for this to act as a significant pathway out of poverty at scale or with the level of returns required. It's a policy pipe dream. It places the onus of ending poverty on the poor. It leaves current structures of accumulation intact. And it risks complicity of those of us involved in simply making the poor work for markets. Okay? It's an abdication to the primacy of markets in determining social outcomes. And so my quest for alternatives began. And for me, the bottom line is this. Employment matters too much to societies to leave to markets alone. And that was why, since then, my efforts have gone into reimagining the role of public employment and public interest employment in civil society through other forms of mechanisms. These are important resources for community-driven development, unlocking the social value of labour even where it has no market value. Yes, I'm talking about the community work program. Here is a football coach who's also a youth mentor. The point is that we need these as complementary strategies. Yes, of course, we need the economy to grow. We need small enterprises to grow. We need good strategies to develop good and viable small enterprises. But the idea that that will deal with the scale of our problem is misleading. India, as I'm sure many of you know, has an Employment Guarantee Act. They've taken this to the next level, guaranteeing every rural household 100 days of work a year. For me, what is important about this is how it shifts the notion of a right to work. From a right to work when work is available in the economy or in markets, to a right to work when work is needed by people. And that's the shift that we need to make. Shifting the onus of employment from the economy to society. It requires some policy imagination, but it can be done. And so finally, the question remains, if markets are social constructs, how do we construct them differently to achieve different distributional outcomes? I will leave you to read the final chapter on this. There's lots of theory about markets as institutions they're social constructs. But to me, that puts the onus back on societies to deal with these issues. And although there are good examples of labour markets being socially constructed, if you like, the examples from other kinds of markets are less convincing. We can glimpse examples. And yes, forms of co-op are part of those examples. But there's very little that is very fundamental in that regard. And so finally, back to inequality. One of the issues in markets is this issue of organisation and holding power. But it's just one manifestation of inequality. In all this experience that I've described, inequality has been a recurring theme at a practical level, with history inscribed in the unequal endowments that market players bring to market processes. illustrating what has become a recognition in the wider discourse, that inequality constrains growth and reproduces existing patterns of distribution through market processes. So, my next bottom line, and my final bottom line, is for any agenda of making markets work better for the poor, inequality is a binding constraint. And so strategies to address inequality are actually a necessary prior condition. And as a corollary, although making markets work better for the poor does matter, it's a process that markets can't and won't drive. Thank you. I really thought I could do that in 10 minutes.
Wow, what a journey. I feel quite overwhelmed by it actually, so I'm going to hand it over to you guys to ask questions and comments and so on. So any questions, any comments on the development conundrum, on the inequality conundrum? Kate, do you want to come forward so that you're more embedded? Right, David? David?
Yeah, given that, my name's David Fish, given that you identified the bottom of the pyramid as a huge big constraint, did you think through any strategies around changing that through interventions in the market by larger forces to change the level of inequality arising from bottom of the pyramid strategy?
Right, okay, there's another hand, yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Kate. I'm a community development worker, and I must tell you that some of us have been inspired by your presentation. But one needs to check whether the issue of land does not fit in terms of addressing the issues of inequality, particularly in the urban areas like the metro in the city of Joburg. The majority of the poor people do not have land, do not have big estates to sell whatever products that they might be having. Is it not suitable then that the issue of land, particularly the expropriation without compensation issue, becomes relevant when it addresses issues of inequality?
Right, and then Chevrolet over there. Yeah.
Thank you. I'd like to get your reaction here, because I believe it always goes back to the issue of Milton Friedman, who asserted that business is all about maximizing shareholder value. So if you are speaking about a developmental agenda by its nature, it's long-term, and maximization of shareholder value is short-term, there will always be this tension between developmental agenda, which is long-term, and short-term quarterly earnings. So how about we find a way of maybe capping on this side of maximization of shareholder value, which is short-term, to try and address this tension between developmental agenda and quarterly earnings?
Right, and then there was one, yes, right at the back there. Sure.
We recently come from the Job Summit, courtesy of the New Dawn. How then would you factor the cooperatives within, and I'm sure you may have read a little bit of the outcomes of the Job Summit. How much should it be skewed towards the cooperative sector as against your typical private enterprise?
I'm going to start forgetting, so if we can take a round. I mean, I think, David, your question, how much did we try to deal with the big structural issues as part of solving the problem? I mean, I think as MDA, as an NGO embedded in NUM, the route to that would have been through NUM, through COSATU, through political process, we didn't feel we had any particular ability other than highlighting the issues to effect such change. And so we were trying to assist people to deal with the cards they'd been dealt in terms of the structure of the economy as we were working within it. But of course, these things should be informing bigger picture strategy around those kinds of issues. And the same on the issue of inequality, absolutely. I think the land is one of the fundamental parts of the issue of received endowments in markets and how those privilege those with those endowments, and how that reproduces inequality on market terms, and supports my final argument that we won't deal with this through market processes. We have to deal with inequality as a prior issue before market outcomes will be different. So I think we're on line there. In terms of the shareholder value issues, I mean, in a sense, that is a tension, but it wasn't really the tension we were particularly dealing with, in the sense that we were largely dealing with very survivalist enterprise, where, yes, we were trying to embed that in a longer-term development strategy, but that specific tension didn't often manifest within the enterprises we were dealing with because they were survivalist. In terms of the Job Summit, I mean, I think that there is still an expectation that worker co-ops are a good vehicle for job creation. And I did commit 8 years of my life working 100% on worker co-ops, and I did come to the conclusion that that is not the case. Now, I know people will disagree, but I think that our terribly urgent need is to find strategies that can go to scale. Worker co-ops are a wonderfully qualitative alternative when in the right conditions, but they are not a mass strategy. If I'm harsh, I sometimes think that we set poor people up for failure by encouraging a model that is so hard. But I know that I can take flack for that, but that is my view, is that I think we should be honest about the fact that this is a route of choice for those who want to develop an alternative economic model, but as a response to mass unemployment, it's an unwieldy vehicle.
Great, okay. Can I take the mic? So there was a hand up, yes, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, but there's a hand, yeah. Come on.
Me or
yes, you. Take the limelight, stand up.
So you can see. Good morning. I'm going to start by making very strong statement or strong assertion. Now, and I'll see how you tied it up to your presentations. Now, one, all through history, all through civilization, all through all societies that you know for the last, say, 5,000 years, three things matter. One is people, okay? Two is technology. Three is money. It doesn't matter in any setup. All those three elements matter and are intertwined and will always go hand in hand. But now, in your presentation, what I didn't hear is perhaps some mechanism or relating to, say, financial literacy in terms of money, or maybe the use of technology in terms of, like, training, using whatever technology that applies. When I say technology here, I'm not just referring to your contemporary tech such as smartphone, AI, and others. I mean technology as perhaps as primitive as a pencil, or you know what I'm saying. So, but technology overall, I didn't hear all those emphases, perhaps in utilizing of that technology, because always technology and money. What I'm trying to say here is money. People and technology will always create money, and people and money create technology. It's always that triangle. You can look at all this history and civilization that you have done. So I want you to try to tie it up into your conversation.
Right, Jackie.
Well, first of all, Kate, thank you for an absolutely magnificent presentation, and I think all of us in SWAP feel really proud to have known you before you went on this journey that you described. What's worrying me is that we're about to confront a massive, massive crisis in the form of the retrenchment of workers from coal-fired power stations. And it could be starting very soon, and it could involve as many as 80,000 people, though there's a lot of controversy about the number. Now, the Job Summit, my comrade, talks about two possible solutions. The one is early retirement, and the other is reducing shifts. In other words, there are no solutions in that document. Is there nothing in your analysis that we can apply to the present and addressing the really massive crisis which we are about to face?
Then there was another hand up. Yeah, there. Okay. Yeah.
Morning. I was quite interested when you said that basically all the cohort stuff that you have studied did not successfully work. Not almost all of them. But the thing that I've noted is that the economy, when it's growing like in a country, it normally promises work development and employment overall in total. But after observing the North African country, particularly Kenya, we noticed that it moves at an increasing rate, that even after, if South Africa could grow at such a rate, then unemployment would be wiped out in the next 10 years or so. But what happens at the end is that no matter how great the economy grows or whatever technological development takes place, it always comes to a point where the market or the monopolists always benefit, but the normal people on the ground always find themselves in a predicament way from now on. So how could it be possible that the society on itself be able to create sustainable ways besides competing in the global economy without having any form of exploitation?
I think so. We'll just keep it at those three, and then let Kate, and then those two other hands I've got here.
I was smiling when you were asking your question because I was thinking if I tried to answer all of those issues in my presentation, I think Carl would have had a heart attack because I was already so over time. In fact, there is quite a lot about the issue of finance and the issue of inequality. One of the examples in the book is that I spoke about the development centres aiming to address market failures, like in relation to business supply stores and the availability of those kinds of supplies. And that the theory was that we would build up to a certain level of scale, and then that business unit would be able to operate on the basis of full cost recovery. What we found is that as soon as we reached that threshold, the big players came into the market. And the big players came into the market with capital. And their cost of capital was zero, because they had capital. Whereas local players who might have wanted to compete with us had to pay 15% interest rates. And so, again, those with existing endowments have an automatic market advantage relative to those without. So it's just another example of the same theme. So there is some issues around finance and on technology. I would say that the Marula program, I mean, we were actually investing in innovation in technology that was creating a breakthrough in access to incomes at the local level. So, without necessarily directly addressing those issues as you put them, I think there are themes in the book that do touch on these things. For Jackie's question, I mean, I know the feeling so well. You know, we confronted wave after wave of retrenchments, and there weren't easy solutions. In terms of what I've had to say offers to the current context, I think the first thing is, please don't reproduce the same mistakes. You know, understand the limits of what we did that didn't work. Don't tell all those retrenched mine workers that they can self-employ their way out of poverty with a mini bakery competing with Albany. You know, just as an example, because that is still happening. But I would argue that that is where public employment comes into the picture, is that when the economy is unable to generate the alternatives, we need publicly resourced alternatives for people. And that's not to say that we mustn't do all the right things so that the economy can absorb people. It's not a kind of It's not to say that doesn't matter, but we haven't got that right yet, and we need a plan B. And until plan A is working, plan B has to be forms of publicly supported employment. That's my view. In terms of the question at the back, if I understood correctly, I think that what you're saying completely reinforces my closing bottom lines. Even where countries grow, the analysis and the theory is now pretty robust. Even the IMF agrees that when a country is highly unequal, its growth will be highly unequal. So inequality breeds inequality. And that's why I'm arguing that changing the distributional outcomes from market processes is not something markets will do. We need policies that address that prior inequality, or we won't see change in market outcomes. And so it does come back to the issue of inequality, it does come back to the issue of land, it does come back to the issue of the monopoly sector, it does come back to all of these huge intractable issues that we haven't quite cracked.
Thanks. Okay, so we've got, I've got 2 hands here, but I'm going to, God, no, I've got 4 actually, so 5. So I was going to ask one of the questions, but I'm going to defer to you guys. So, but will you please introduce yourselves? I should have said this earlier. So, Conrad from the EFF. And then I'll...
Thank you, Chair. Kuzo Chetro, an independent right. Yeah. Maybe you touched on the issue of the community works program. So I don't know in your research whether you did research, find out, because the major problem in our country now, in light of the high unemployment rate at 27%, if you did engage with the government, why the last 6 months, or I think the longest 12 months, so they are not sustainable. Even some which are sustainable, maybe they will last 3-6 months, and then they will collapse. Thank you.
I'm Carmel Maroc.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure if it's a question or, or comment or a combination of both. But I mean, I'm struggling because there were a couple of comments about the Job Summit, and my whole life has been very immersed in the Job Summit in the last few months, that you've so eloquently captured the central tension in the Job Summit, which was how much do we go the project route and how much are we systemic? And in a sense, that was the biggest negotiating, unresolved issue of the Job Summit. And it's an incredibly difficult issue to resolve, and people who've read the details of the Job Summit, and I can see some have, will know that projects kind of won, in a way, with a few kind of, okay, let's talk value chain so we can say we're talking systems. But really projects won, but it's difficult. So on the one hand, look, it's a major success. We can count 240,000 jobs, and that's amazing, given that's pretty much what the economy is creating on its own. So it's doubling it. But it's nothing when you consider the number of young people that are leaving school every year, let alone people who are being retrenched. But the difficulty, and I think you really captured it well, and that's why I'm saying it's kind of a question, but it's kind of, I don't know, is that to get to systemic solutions is so difficult. So business says the systemic solutions are actually government do your job better. If when you ask for a water license, you got a water license, we could produce more jobs. So business has an answer to systemic, and it's do your job better. And it's your Tshwane example, actually, where the municipality is doing little projects instead of actually making sure there's water and transport and things like that. So I think that is an area that we need to maybe look at more when we're talking systemic, in addition to public employment programs. And it's like an obvious thing, do your job better, but it's, how does that feature in how does that become part of the discourse? I don't know if that's something you've looked at in ways that we can hold that accountable when we're looking at job creation. So I guess that's the one part of the question. Because the other part is, I mean, business in one meeting, which got extremely tense, eventually said, you see, you misunderstand, the point is labour. We only...
Stand up because you're talking long.
Sorry. That you only
I'll be quicker. I get that point. That you only, we only exist as business if we are going to make profit. So you can't ask us to change who we are and say that's how we support job creation. And Avril was muttering next to me, well, actually we should start singing socialism, what, after your... Because unless you change the economy, there is no systemic change. So I'm just wondering, in the context of the fact that there's little appetite to change the economy,
Well,
what there is.
well, that's so how much
No,
new,
I'm not saying we shouldn't. I'm just asking
how much new dawn is there is the question. So, I mean, I do just want, I'm going to throw my comment in and see what Kate thinks, which is, so what if you banned the big supermarkets from rural areas? And it created the space for local entrepreneurial development around supermarkets, for example. I mean, this is about restructuring markets. There was a hand over here. Is that okay?
My question feeds into your point. Can I ask it?
Stand up and say who you are and then talk quickly.
Thank you, Dr. Phillip. Stuart Robertson. My question relates to your concluding points about the restructuring of markets as social constructs and the idea of like societal development as opposed to social development, which is more institutional change. And my question is, what can consumers do more broadly across the whole economy to act as a block within the economy to restructure and influence markets? So it speaks to your point about strategy. So what should the strategy be for consumers united across all lines to influence the economy and change it?
So could you hear at the back? So what strategy could consumers as a block adopt to change markets? And then there was, yes.
Actually, the question of transport.
Can you stand up and say who you are, please?
Francis.
Yeah, but stand up as well.
The question of transport. Most of the time, the corps, you move from A and then you go to B for consumption. I didn't hear you mention the question of transport, the challenge, the dynamics, most of the time there's a challenge. And when it comes to the question of realizing or using opportunities on the ground, the broad China people, China invests in Africa, is that China does not ask questions. Like you are saying that they need assurance that there will be supply. They go in and then they take the opportunity. And my question is, don't you think that hesitation is the one that creates opportunity for China to move in Africa?
Well, and then where was another hand? There was a. Okay, so we'll take it there.
On the CWP, I think the point about public employment, just to make a wider point, is public employment can be awful. Public employment can be badly designed. It can, pay wages that are too low. So I think it's important also to understand, like every other solution, public employment is not just a panacea that can solve everything. There are important design elements that must go into it being a solution. In terms of the CWP, I do think that the CWP has very important strengths in terms of its community-driven character. I think that right now we're facing some problems in a context in which my own understanding of the situation is that I think that there's been a procurement process that I think is pretty deeply flawed, and I think that there are risks to the program going forward. I think it's important that people who understand the program actually keep on top of what's happening with that and provide support to processes of challenging what has been, I think, an unfortunate and possibly corrupt process. In terms of Carmel, I think that was an existential cry from the heart representing all of us, so I don't feel a need to answer it directly. I mean, I think those are the tensions. There is a huge tension between, but I also think that between the project level and the systemic, there is a whole range. And the project level is right at the one end of that range, so that even within the relatively local context of an MDA, something like a development center that can be open to all where you design your interventions in a way that they are able to respond on a demand-driven basis to need. You know, to me, the absolute worst-case project scenario is this selection process where some group of self-appointed whoever's go and choose people in community. You know, to me, that's like the one end of the spectrum. And between that and the truly systemic level changes, there are quite a lot of, and I think we need to unpack more. I didn't, but we need to unpack more. What are the different options so that we can find routes that satisfy the need for something to be seen to be done now in my community that I can see, which is the kind of project level urge, versus the more systemic level thing. And now I've forgotten.
Consumers. What can consumers do?
Oh, and your question.
And transport.
Well, I do think that one of the biggest missed opportunities in the post-apartheid period was that we didn't use the organizational energy out of the UDF phase to support forms of economic cooperation like consumer co-ops. So all the energy went into worker co-ops because they were seen as the form of co-op that was socialist and that would challenge conventional forms of organization in the enterprise and that would create jobs. And some of that understanding, I think, was a misunderstanding. But really, if you look at many of the countries in the world that really do have strong co-op movements, consumer co-ops are the backbone of that, and they give ordinary people consumer power. So, and you know, if you look at township economies, we went for spouses. You know, there was no effort at a collective consumer response to filling the gap that existed at that time when the big supermarkets were not there. It was a missed opportunity, and I still think and that's why I was emphasizing in the beginning the different market locations of different types of co-ops and the different strengths of different types of co-ops in these debates. And I do still think that the consumer co-ops and indeed the producer co-ops for small farmers, unfortunately discredited by the history of the big white agricultural co-ops, but nevertheless that those are very important instruments for poor producers, for consumers, for and partly that answers Carl's question as well. I don't know what would happen if we banned the supermarkets from rural areas. Yeah, you know, how you deal with that monopoly power and its impacts is a really vexed issue.
And then there was the transport.
And I think the issue of transport and the cost of transport is just one component amongst many that impact on the viability of co-ops. It's just part of the competitive mix. These are the challenges that co-ops experience in competing in markets. And often if they are in remote areas that are trying to market in other areas, then transport will be a big cost and it will affect their bottom line.
Great, thanks. I'm afraid that we've come to the end of it. You know, people have got to go off and do things. I mean, this discussion could go on for a long, long time. What I really want to, you know, what I find really fascinating and deeply instructive is the journey that Kate's travelled from these sort of micro-focused initiatives, with successes and failures, inspiring but limited constraints, has taken her right back to the big constraints, the big systemic issues. And I really think that that's what we have to focus our minds on. So if we're talking about inequality, if we're thinking about inequality, the point is that using the market to overcome inequality is a contradiction in terms. And that we have to sort of start thinking about bigger market-changing initiatives that allow for different kinds of development. And I'm afraid that means taking on the power of the powers that be. And that's big capital and many others. So with that sense of a new dawn, that's still in question. Can we really, a round of applause for Kate and all her work. Can I say that I think that this is a round of applause also for all the communities and people and individuals in those co-ops and in those projects who've worked with Kate over all this time to try and make livelihoods out of very thin markets.